Good morning. Welcome to episode 80 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined, as I am every Thursday, by Mia O'Brien of Helmets and Heels, which you can catch from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern each weekday on 92.5 XM, 92.5 FM, and 1010 XL. Mia, welcome to the show. What's up? We got some breaking news yesterday that we're going to go over and kind of sort out just the after effects.
Episode 80, Gus. That's what I'm most excited about, as I also realized I was just talking to you off camera. I didn't even have my microphone on me. So, hey, listen, episode 80, but we're still learning, I guess, as we go along. But also, we appreciate everybody and all the support as we've progressed to a daily show. And also, of course, as the Jags continue to make moves in the Liam Cohen, James Gladstone era. Excited to see you guys already in the chat. Keep it going throughout the course of today's podcast because, of course, part of the fun of this is the interaction with you guys. We can't wait to see who you guys think the Jaguars should be acquiring in light of that breaking news yesterday, which just so happened to occur while one Gus Logue was in studio on Helmets and Heels. Are some saying this was planned? I know Floyd, who just left us our first chat for today's podcast, I think he was the first one on the Helmets and Heels live chat, who said, did Gus break the news? Is that why Gus is hopping on with us? I mean, look, I was saying it was Ian Schefter who broke it. Maybe you are Ian Schefter. Just saying. Yeah. As long as you're not getting into any fights at Starbucks, I think we're in the clear.
Ian Schefter or Adam Rappaport. Yeah, no, I haven't been to a Starbucks in a long time. Definitely not getting any fights there. Haven't been in Indianapolis in a while either. But yeah, no, if you missed it, yesterday the news dropped that wide receiver Christian Kirk is being released by the Jaguars, or as Adam Schefter broke it, the Jaguars, quote unquote, plan to release Christian Kirk, which would save $10.4 million in 2025 cap space. Obviously, there's now a big hole at wide receiver behind Brian Thomas Jr., because, yes, there are other bodies in the receiver room, but I don't know whether any of them can really be expected to fill Kirk's role, not just in the slot, but as like their starting receiver next to Brian Thomas Jr. And so so today me and I are going to go over 3 potential replacements for Kirk. We're going to do one in the draft market, one in free agency market, and then one potential NFL draft pick. But before we get to replacement options, Mia, just like, what was your reaction to the news? Were you surprised? Did you think that like it was always going to be one of Kirk or Engram? And then do you think that they will look for like a replacement, or do you think that it's feasible that they might just be like, we got Parker Washington?
Yeah, not surprised, Gus. Unfortunately, this is the nature of the league. I think that Christian Kirk and his camp had done a really good job in the last few weeks. And I'm not saying this included Trevor Lawrence or not, because I think ultimately Trevor would tell you this is a business. But I think that they did a really good job of, at the very least, projecting the message of, hey, we are willing to restructure. We recognize that $24 million cap hit is a very large number, especially for someone who made it clear he wanted to retire here in Jacksonville and he wanted to spend the rest of his career here. And look, I think it's naive to suggest that just because he's the quarterback's best friend, he was going to be spared of being a cap casualty. That's not how the NFL works. And so I think ultimately, when Christian Kirk was signed in 2022 to a 4-year contract, even if Trent Baalke was still the GM to this day, and would he have actually seen through the duration of that contract? The answer is no. And so ultimately, they were always going to find the next cheapest, younger option, because that's just the way the league works. And it's unfortunate. Obviously, we wish Christian all the best, but at the same time, this is where you become a functional NFL organization, right? And so as much as we're going to run through, and again, we appreciate everybody in the comments leaving their suggestions, we're going to get into some of those names. I can't come away from, Gus, as much as we're going to run through one name to draft, one name to sign in free agency, one to trade, I could probably give you 3 names that the Jaguars could draft to replace Christian Kirk. Not to mention, as somebody already alluded to, Parker Washington, the in-house replacement. And that is probably more of a reality than the Jaguars signing someone in free agency next week or trading for someone to replace the snap count that Christian Kirk would have filled, which ultimately, as we talked about on Helmets and Heels yesterday, Gus, I don't think there were going to be enough snaps to go around to justify that $24 million cap number, because if Evan Ingram's going to play in the slot, Liam Cohen made it clear at the Combine last week, Brian Thomas Jr. is going to see snaps in the slot. Parker Washington is still on the roster. Where were there going to be snaps for Christian Kirk? As much as, yes, he believes, I believe, because I've seen it in some supply, he can go inside, outside. He can't go inside, outside at the rates that the wide receivers in Los Angeles or Tampa that Liam Cohen has worked with previously have. Maybe.
Yeah, I do think that the Jaguars were like acting like an adult organization when they did draft Parker Washington, because I think that he made sense as like a future successor to Christian Kirk, but specifically in Doug Peterson's scheme, specifically in a scheme that's kind of like spread out West Coast. Parker will have like option routes and a lot of space to work over the middle of the field from the slot alignment. But that's kind of like yesterday's slot receiver, like the cliche, like Wes Welker, Julian Edelman types, where like it's truly spread out offenses, and you just have so much space to work against linebackers and slot receivers. But now, like today's slot receiver is a lot different. Like today's slot receiver, I think is more so like what Liam Cohen does with his slot receivers, which is what Sean McVay does with his slot receivers, which is really having the versatility to not just be able to run routes out of the slot, but also line up as like a pseudo tight end on the line of scrimmage and be able to like knife across the backfield on split zone cuts and take out a defensive end, and then to fake that block and pop out into the slot, and then to line up and just straight up double team defensive ends, and then to take jet sweeps, and then to be as effective as a blocker as you are as a receiver in the screen game. Like Cohen's offense thrives and is built off of versatility. And so to have a versatile offense, you need versatile players. And I think that Parker Washington is a good player, but I just think that he's like a niche role player. And I'm not convinced that like that niche is going to be present for a significant amount of snaps in Cohen's offense. And so I think that, again, like I'm not trying to like bash Parker. I just think that he would have been a better fit in Doug Peterson's system, like long term. But now that it is a new offensive system, I think that he's one of those guys that's, even though he's definitely deserves to be on an NFL roster, could kind of get phased out of the organization maybe. And so we shall see.
I think with regards to Parker, so two things. Number one, he last year, and again, you could take this however you want, especially in light of the Matthew Stafford New York Giants situation. He made it very clear to me that he went to Chad Hall, the former wide receiver coach, last summer and was like, I want to take snaps outside, because he recognized that obviously the best availability is ability, as well as, or the best ability is availability. And if you can play multiple positions on the field, then obviously that increases your value. And look, he's not an outside wide receiver. I'll give him credit that he's trying to learn to be one, because I agree, Gus, that in the Liam Cohen, Sean McVay system, that is what you have to be able to do to make a roster in either of those organizations. And with Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota, anyone from that tree, Kyle Shanahan, you have to be able to play all three wide receiver positions. And I think what's so interesting about that conversation is that's been a critique for 2 years now of the Trent Baalke, Doug Peterson administration, because when you saw a Christian Kirk go down with injury, once Zay Jones went down week 2 against the Kansas City Chiefs in 2023, the Jaguars offense collapsed like a house of cards, because you had someone who specifically filled a certain role. And as soon as that person was taken out of the equation, Nate Tice of Yahoo Sports has been on this soapbox for 2 years now. As soon as you took that person out of the equation, not only did you not have the onboarding process to be able to insert someone off the bench into the lineup, but additionally, you didn't have the flexibility to change your offensive operation. And that's why I go back to Liam Cohen came to Tampa and probably wanted to run more of an air raid offense, if I'm being frank. And at least that's what our friends in Tampa have told us, our colleagues over there. And as soon as Mike Evans and Chris Godwin go down, he goes, all right, well, I guess I've got to lean into, we're running 12 and 13 personnel, because what other option do I have? And that was the emergence of, that led to the emergence of K. Dotton, and that led to the emergence of Bucky Irving in the run game. And so that's where I think that more than anything, yes, you need 3 receivers who can do a whole heck of a lot. But I think Liam Cohen being adaptable says to me that Parker Washington still could have a role on this team, especially depending on what the team ultimately decides to do with Devin Duvernay. But also, I think that in the long term, if you're going to be running heavier personnel, and you're going to have more tight ends on the field, and they're obviously going to go to the slot. And if Brian Thomas Jr., who your offense is, quote, going to run through, is also going to be taking snaps there, you were always going to move on from Christian Kirk. And yes, I don't think that Parker Washington may be for the long term. I still think, though, he's proven that he has other value to his game that will keep him on the roster this year, but maybe not be the replacement that we're here to discuss today.
Yeah, I feel like absolute worst case scenario, he'll be like the 5th or 6th receiver on the depth chart, but then he'll also be like an important special teams player, as if not the primary returner, definitely one of their top 2 or 3 return options, at least as it stands on the current roster. Floyd said, don't forget about Gabe. He's bigger and physical, played as a complement to Diggs. But like Kirk is like the slot guy. I do think that Gabe has some versatility where he can like line up into the slot and do some things out of there, but like he's not really like the guy that like you're lining up as, again, like the pseudo tight end, pseudo 6 offensive lineman that's like truly attached to the line of scrimmage. It can do a whole multitude of things. I think that you're right to say don't forget about Gabe, but I think Gabe's role is just like that boundary X receiver, and he's gonna not really be like a true replacement for Kirk.
So Floyd, I will tell you this, and we discussed it, Gus and I, on Helmets and Heels yesterday. Ultimately, the fact that the last 3 years the Jaguars have signed a wide receiver in free agency, and we have had a conversation of this is the blocking wide receiver. That is not where the modern NFL offense is. All 3 wide receivers should be blocking wide receivers. Like that should not be a conversation. And unfortunately, it has been in Jacksonville. So the fact that Gabe Davis was signed with that idea is kind of hilarious. And the fact that Zay Jones was looked at in that same light. Not that those 2 gentlemen can't do other things, but it is kind of hilarious.
For sure. All right. That was a good intro, I think. But with all that said, and again, to reiterate your caveat that the Jaguars are certainly more likely to find a replacement for Kirk in the draft than via the trade or free agency markets. But all that said, what is one player that you have your eye on in the trade market that you think the Jaguars could be interested in acquiring?
Right. So the trade market, the obvious names, yes, I see David and Reedy and company saying DK Metcalf. Ultimately, if you were to trade for DK Metcalf, who did formally request a trade yesterday after the release of Tyler Lockett by the Seattle Seahawks, if you trade for DK, you're going to have to pay him. And that is not a position the Jaguars, even with oodles of cap space next offseason, really want to find themselves in. Again, the goal has always been we need to get away from these Band-Aid free agent fixes, and we need to start developing our own. To Floyd's point, yes, the next obvious name is Cooper Kupp. I'm actually going to table Cooper Kupp, though, because at least at this juncture, the Rams have had him on the trade block, Gus, for a month. And they haven't been able to find a dance partner. And so I think he actually is going to be my answer for free agency, because I think ultimately the Rams are going to have to release him. That brings us to T. Higgins, who, by all accounts, the Cincinnati Bengals are going to, at some point in time, come to a long-term agreement with. It has been a long, winding road to get us there. I don't know if we will ever get there. Obviously, he has the relationship with Trevor Lawrence. Yes, he's not the quote-unquote slot receiver that perhaps in Jacksonville Jaguar fans are accustomed to. He, like Brian Thomas Jr., has inside-outside flexibility. But I think that ultimately, if we're talking a trade, Gus, the market is not as deep as people think. And that's why I told you, like, I could give you 3 names in the draft who I think are more likely to end up on the Jaguars roster and replace Christian Kirk than I could someone via trade.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I did have Kupp as like the name I had written down for this, but I do agree with your point that like he's probably more likely to come to Jacksonville or really to go to any other NFL team via free agency after he's cut by the Rams as opposed to a trade. But hypothetically, the Jaguars could trade like probably a 7th round pick, but definitely a day 3 pick to be able to get Kupp. And then the question mark would be like, does he want a new contract? Right. How much of the dead money are the Jaguars taking versus the Rams of his current contract? But yeah, Kupp would just be the perfect fit in Jacksonville for like the slot receiver that Cohen wants, which is pretty obvious considering that Cohen worked with Kupp and Sean McVay in the Rams for a few seasons. But in terms of like the versatility, being able to do everything inside and out, just like the perfect guy to play alongside Brian Thomas, but then also be like the veteran for him. Obviously, the big caveat with Kupp is that he's missed, I think, 19 games over the past 3 seasons. And so if you're getting him for like 12 games in 2025, that's probably a win. But I do think that like the veteran leadership is definitely going to be like a just big selling point for the Jaguars, especially with how much new Jaguars general manager James Gladstone talked up intangibles over the past week. I think they would definitely like to have not just that kind of player, but also that kind of person in the building. And so definitely a name to watch. But Mia, so to move on from the trade market to the free agency market, are there any free agents that you think the Jaguars should be interested in? All right. I can
like honestly, like Gus, like I pulled it up this morning, right? And I was like, let me just like take a look as I'm laying in bed. And I'm like, I had already kind of made up my mind last night what my answer to you on this podcast was going to be, which is Cooper Kupp once he's released. And I'm looking at this list, right? And it ties in perfectly with the conversation that we were just having about what is the slot in the modern NFL offense in Liam Cohen, Sean McVay's offensive scheme. Here are the names right now that SpotTrack has as the most premier available wide receivers. Devontae Adams, who, yes, I know there are at least a couple of you clamoring for him. I do not see a world in which he comes to Jacksonville solely because I am still in the camp of he's going to follow Aaron Rodgers wherever Aaron Rodgers goes. I know there are those who don't believe that, but I, in my heart of hearts, do. Stephon Diggs, about to be 32 years old once the season begins. No, especially coming off of an ACL injury. Like, yes, was he playing meaningful minutes for the Houston Texans before tearing his ACL? Yes, but no. Keenan Allen, about to be 33 years old. Chris Godwin, again, much like T. Higgins, I understand is a pipe dream for Jaguar fans. But ultimately, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to try to find a way to keep him. And I believe in, get this one on the record, Gus, I believe in Jason Licht. I believe in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and their ability to secure and keep their own than I do the Cincinnati Bengals trying to keep the services of T. Higgins, which I believe that's going to get done. So Chris Godwin is going to stay. Mari Cooper and Brandon Cooks are also both getting up there in years. Obviously, there was some smoke at the combine last week. I know Matthew Berry put it in his top 25 rumors that he heard that Cooper may be over the hill. Brandon Cooks also getting up there in years. Maybe he's a fit. Deontay Johnson is obviously a guy who was well-traveled a season ago. And then guess who the next name is on the list? Christian Kirk. So if you're looking for a quote-unquote upgrade, I just don't see it. You're not going to sign Tyler Lockett at 33 years old. You're not going to sign DeAndre Hopkins or Mike Williams, also in their 30s. Like, that's the point that you're at if you're to go the free agency route. There is no Christian Kirk at 26 years old like he was in 2022 that you would be able to pluck off the free agent market and plug in there. It's why I truly believe that the Jaguars will roll with the combination of Evan Ingram and Parker Washington this season, plus drafting somebody, which is where we're going to go to next.
Right. Okay, so that all makes a lot of sense, but just to throw out some other names, because I agree that Godwin is kind of like the pipe dream. There's a non-zero chance he comes to Jacksonville, but definitely a much, much, much greater chance that he returns to Tampa Bay. I definitely am just expecting T. Higgins to remain a Bengal. I think Devontae Adams is like the only other name you mentioned in terms of the older guys that like I would be interested in, but I also don't think that Adams would be interested in at all. And coming to Jacksonville, I think he's either going to want to play with Aaron Rodgers. I'm sure that's what's going to happen. But even if not, he'll probably want to return home to the West Coast. And I don't know if he would like be willing to be the Robin to Brian Thomas's Batman.
He wasn't willing to be Garrett Wilson's Robin. Like, right. I mean, no offense, but it's just that's the reality.
But I will throw a couple other names. Darius Slayton from the Giants, I'm definitely keeping my eye on. I think he's a guy that's certainly less likely to return to his former team. He had like a 4.39 40 time in 2019 coming out of Auburn. He's been one of the better deep threats in the league since he came out of college. And so he would be a guy that would essentially like compete with Gabe Davis for like the perimeter receiver, stretching the defense role. But I think it was ESPN's Jeremy Fowler who said in an article a month or two ago that the Jaguars are looking for speed at the position, which makes a lot of sense to me because like you don't, as great as Brian Thomas and his speed is, you don't want him to be the only guy that's threatening vertically because like you're using Brian Thomas all over the field, not just as a deep guy. And so when you're using Brian as a short or intermediate target, you want another guy to be able to help kind of dictate defenses or at least not be able to like flood the defense to where Brian Thomas is. So they definitely need another guy to kind of take the top off the defense again. I think Darius Slayton fits that to a T. Tutu Atwell, I think, is also worth a look from the Rams because I assume Gladstone was there when the Rams drafted him. Cohen might have also been there as well. And I think that Tutu isn't the kind of guy that's like going to be doing like a bunch of like jet sweeps and like orbit motions and like a bunch of like designer stuff behind the line of scrimmage and near the line of scrimmage. He's going to be a guy that's like less of a Curtis Samuel type and more of like a Brandon Cooks type where he's like, even though he is a smaller guy, because of his speed, he's really used as a downfield threat. And so Tutu Atwell, because of the Rams connection, but also his speed, I think is worth a look. But again, agree with your general point. So let's get into draft. Who are some names that you're keeping your eye on, Mia?
The obvious, the one that so many of us in Jacksonville have been referring to as Cooper Kupp Light, the one, the only Jack Betch of TCU, formerly of LSU. Look,
Mm.
even independent of the crazy, unfortunate circumstance surrounding Jack and his family, with his brother being a victim of the New Orleans just terror attack, an awful situation, and the fact that he has entered the lexicon of so many because of that awful disaster. Independent of that, back in December, I earmarked Jack Betch as a name to watch. If Liam Cohen, if someone from the McVay tree was to come in and succeed Doug Peterson as the head coach of the Jaguars and take over the offensive operation. He is 6'1", 31.5-inch arms, 214 pounds, 9-inch hands. The measurables are there. Did not run the 40 last week. Pretty good jumping numbers. Ran a 6.84 in the 3-cone drill. 19 presses on the bench. None of that really matters because turn on the tape. This is a guy who the only reason he was at TCU was because he was behind the likes of Brian Thomas Jr. and a guy named Malik Neighbors at LSU. He still is friends with all of them. He has inside-outside versatility. He's competitive at the point of attack. He is competitive at the line of scrimmage, a willing blocker. Again, this guy just screams Cooper Kupp clone. He's high character, high IQ, again, independent of what happened on New Year's Day. And from the jump, you just look at this guy and you're like, okay, why would you trade for Cooper Kupp and potentially have to pay him even more money for an extension when you could draft this guy in what many believed would be a 3rd or a 4th round opportunity? But after he balled out at the Senior Bowl and was named the most valuable player, that's where I have concerns now, Gus. I think Jack Betch may sneak into the late second round, if not early second round. Some people think even late first. And that's where I'm a little concerned if I'm a Jaguars fan who's been eyeing him for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I would think that he's kind of like a clear-cut 3rd round caliber prospect, but because like wide receiver is a position that's so sought after, we saw so many guys last year get scooped up in the 1st round. Ricky Pearsall, no one was expecting. Xavier Worthy, I don't think anyone thought of as a 1st round receiver, at least until after he broke the 40-yard dash record at the combine. But yeah, definitely a name that I'm keeping my eye on as well. It feels like he'd be the single best fit in Jacksonville, at least among like wide receivers that aren't expected to be picked in the 1st round. I've seen a lot of Puka Nacua comps for him too, honestly, but he's definitely got that like toughness that Gladstone wants. He's arguably or probably the best run blocking receiver in the class. As you said, inside-outside versatility. So yeah, that would definitely make a lot of sense for the Jaguars on day 2. So I think that's kind of like the most obvious name that we had people saying Jack Beck before you even started that. But do you have any other names, maybe a less popular name that you're also?
I do indeed. I actually have the Puka Nacua clone. Are you ready for this one, Gus?
Give it to me.
Isaac Tesla, Arkansas, senior wide receiver. I'm going to run through his measurables, and then I'm going to run through Puka Nacua. Isaac Tesla at Arkansas, 6'4", 214, 31.125-inch arms, 10-inch hands. Puka Nacua coming out of BYU, 6'2", 201 pounds, 31.5-inch arms, 9.5-inch hands. Advantage there, Tesla. Tesla was the fastest wide receiver. He was the fastest of the bigger slot wide receivers, I should say. He had some of the best jumps of any wide receiver at the NFL Combine last week. Ripped off a 4.43 40-yard dash, 39.5-inch vertical jump, 10.9 in the broad, a 4.5 20-yard shuttle. Puka Nacua, when you look at his numbers, if they want to show up, they're not showing up. Okay. I'm going to read the Lance Zierlein projections for these two. He had them both. Obviously, we now know what Puka Nacua ended up being. He had him as a average backup or special teamer. That is what he also has for Tesla, although his raw athletic score is a little bit higher than Nakua's. Here's what he writes for Tesla. Big slot receiver whose stock might be on the rise after his performance during Senior Bowl, can mismatch smaller corners with his frame and play strength, a reliable pass catcher when contested, yada, yada, yada. His ball skills and ability to work down the field from the slot should carry backup value for teams in the market. Okay. Here's what he wrote for Puka Nacua. Athletic wideout, lacking twitch or speed to attack NFL man coverage at a successful rate. However, the ball skills and competitive nature he brings to the field give him a fighting chance to make a roster. Might need to be used as a possession receiver operating from the slot. Point is, this modern slot that we've spent the bulk of today's program discussing, That is Puka Nacua, because that inside-outside flexibility, that is Jack Bech, and that is Isaac Tesla, who, while certainly, yes, his numbers at Arkansas were not as eye-popping as his numbers when he was at his previous stop at the D2 level, I think technically is what it's considered. Yes, you can also attribute that to, and I love Sam Pittman more than anybody else on 1010XL, maybe not Matt Hayes, but who was the quarterback? He had KJ Jefferson, or a shell of KJ Jefferson, the year prior. And this year he had a true sophomore. And so I think that if you pair Tesla with a capable offensive system that fits him, he's a guy you could get in the top of the 4th round, maybe even a second, 4th round pick that then you could turn into your version of Puka Nacua.
I love that. Yeah, because I feel like a lot of these names, like not just Jack Beck, but I saw a lot of Jaden Higgins in the comments.
Yeah, we'll talk about the 2 Iowa State guys too.
Or whatever his name is from Stanford. There's a lot of really interesting prospects, but a lot of the guys that I think we all know the names of are like pretty much like day 2 guys, maybe even could sneak into the 1st round. So I love that name because I hadn't even heard of Isaac Tesla. So that's definitely a good shout. The random sleeper name that I've got is Mario Williams from Tulane. Roll Wave. He's started out his career at Oklahoma, then followed.
Wasn't he the number 1 recruit in the country?
I think so, yeah.
I think he was the number 1 recruit in the country.
And then started at Oklahoma, followed Lincoln Riley. I was blanking on his name. Followed Lincoln Riley to USC for 2 seasons. And then last year he played for Tulane, became the 12th receiver in school history to reach 1,000 yards, the first Tulane player since, I think, 2013. And he's another guy that's like kind of similar to Tutu Atwell, or like certainly not a perfect comparison, but the way I said, he's less like a Curtis Samuel gadgety player and more like a Brandon Cooks, like truly a downfield guy. And because of his size, he is really undersized. He's not really the kind of guy that's like going to be making a lot of blocks really against anyone, but especially like near the line of scrimmage against defensive ends and stuff like that. But again, for like the Tutu Atwell role, for the Darius Slayton role, for like just getting speed on the perimeter, I think he makes a lot of sense because the inside-outside versatility that we've been preaching is certainly going to be the first thing that they're looking for as like a true Kirk replacement or even Kirk upgrade. But in terms of like rounding out the rest of the receiver room, I think that's where the Darius Slayton, Tutu Atwell, and here Mario Williams names also make sense in terms of just adding depth.
A couple notes here as we put a bow on today's show, Gus. I think it's safe to say that in replacing Christian Kirk, quality number 1 has to be inside-outside versatility. I think we're safe in saying that. Mm-hmm. Number 2, in case you joined us a little bit late, go back to the top of the program or listen back on demand, folks. The slot is no longer what you once were told a slot receiver traditionally looks like. It is no longer that smaller, kind of twitchy, kind of not, but does the dirty work underneath. Maybe he's undersized type guy that perhaps Christian Kirk, Parker Washington profile as. Now, with that said, I want to get to some of the names that were listed in the comments. So Floyd asked about Savion Williams. So Savion Williams out of TCU, the running mate to Jack Bech, 6'4", 222, 32.5-inch arms, 10 1/4 inch hands, tested, 4.48 in the 40. Athletic freak, but he's a bigger bodied guy. I also saw someone in the chat say Elijah Moore, who is only 24 years old. Obviously, it did not work out with the Jets. It did not work out with the Browns. I would also invite the name that did not work out here in Jacksonville, and not to say that this is a one-size-fits-all, but Laviska Shenault, who many people have comped Savion Williams to. In discussing what the future of the slot position looks like and what it will look like in Liam Cohen's system, I think it's important to note, Gus, that I think, and that maybe I'm generalizing here, tell me if I'm wrong, I think we've gone from a world where the slot was viewed as that's the undersized guy who does the dirty work, and maybe he's, a little smaller, but he's got speed, but he's not quite as fast to play outside, right? So that's what the slot traditionally was. Then it moved to, it needs to be a bigger bodied guy who basically could be a running back if you wanted him to. He can run off a jet sweep. He can block, yes, but he's a bigger bodied, essentially faster running back. That's what Savion Williams is. That's what Laviska Shenault is. That's what Elijah Moore is, right? We have now progressed, folks, to a point where the slot receiver is neither of those things. It's essentially another XY receiver who can just come out and move around as a chess piece on the offensive side of the ball. That is why we're looking at names like Jack Betch. That is why Cooper Kupp has become one of the most effective slot wide receivers in the game today. That's why you see Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase operating at all three levels of the wide receiver position. And it's why you're also going to see Brian Thomas Jr. taking slot reps this season. And so I think that that's a really important delineation to make as we run through some of these names, because I think that we're defaulting to, well, you need a small guy or you need this thick guy. And that's not the case in the modern NFL.
Yeah, I mean, you put it well with chess piece. I think it's really like, it's not one or the other, it's both. Like it used to be, so yesterday's slot receiver, it's all about the opposing defenses really, because like slot receivers like Wes Welker in 2007 and like through the late 2000s and early 2010s, like the slot receiver was like that small guy because opposing defenses like were still trying to stop the run because most offenses were running the ball. So defenses were trying to stop the run. And so since defenses were trying to stop the run, they had bigger bodies on the field, more linebackers as opposed to defensive backs. So then guys like Wes Welker and Julian Edelman were able to take advantage of mismatches because of their like twitchiness and short area speed against those bigger and slower linebackers and even safeties. But now there's a lot more passing in the NFL. So defenses are playing against the pass. So they've gotten lighter. They're playing more defensive backs on the field as opposed to linebackers. And so now that's where you saw the not the resurgence, but just the start of like the power slot, where like you're running routes out of the slot and like kind of like a mismatch weapon in the passing game, but you're also expected to do some dirty work over the middle of the field. And so now like dirty work doesn't just mean like run a route against linebackers. It also means like run a route against linebackers, block defensive ends, fake a block of defensive end, and then pop out into the flat again. There's just like a lot more stuff on the plate for slot receivers in today's game.
I also saw Matt Jones. We won't even pull the comment up because he referred to him as the Hispanic man out of Miami. His name is Xavier Restrepo. I saw him reference Xavier Restrepo, who I loved. I earmarked Restrepo in November as, in my estimation, and unfortunately it didn't play out this way, I thought he was going to go to the Senior Bowl and be this year's Ladd McConkey. He still has that potential, I think, once he gets to the league. But once again, Gus, and I think this is a great place to put a bow on today's show, here were Xavier Restrepo's measurables from the combine last week. 5'10", 209, 29 3/8 inch arms, 9 1/8 inch hands. That's similar measurables to Christian Kirk. That is more of a traditional slot receiver. And I think the point we wanted to make for you guys on today's episode is that if you're parting ways with Christian Kirk, outside of going out and getting Christian Kirk light, I guess if Restrepo's there in like the 4th or the 5th, I think he's going to end up being a day 2 pick after he tested his pro day. Like, I don't see the Jags literally replacing him with a cheaper option, especially when Parker Washington is also in-house. And so that's why I think you're going to see them draft Tesla, Jack Betch if he's there, Jalen Noel, Jaden Higgins, someone with that inside-outside versatility, a bigger-bodied wide receiver, yes, not the thick Laviska Shenault running back bully ball slot receiver that you're also used to seeing, but someone who a casual NFL fan would see and they would say, oh, well, he must be an outside wide receiver. No, he operates out of the slot, and that's okay.
Yeah, well, that was a great conversation. Mia, appreciate you, as always, for joining. It'll be interesting to see just how the receiver room, obviously the whole roster too, shakes out this offseason for the Jaguars. But me will be back next Thursday at 9:04 a.m. I will be back at 9:04 a.m. with Hacker. We'll talk.
Apparently, Hacker's breaking DK Metcalf news per Alex in the chat. So I'm excited. Yeah. I'm excited to see what you and Hacker have in store tomorrow morning, Gus.
Well, I was gonna ask you if you wanted to do like a free agency preview, but then this Kirk news drops. So maybe Hacker and I will do a little bit of a free agency preview before the tampering window opens up on Monday. So again, 9:04 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. See you guys then. Mia, thanks as always. Take care, everyone.